Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to answer the question, what is Tailwind? This is mostly about Tailwind and a little bit about surprising stuff that I learned about SVG that's pretty awesome. Let's get cracking. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I have been a long time Rubyist, but now I'm mostly working with Elixir, GraphQL, TypeScript, and React. I've been doing this web stuff for a while. And I also work at a company called Alembic, and we do all kinds of stuff, but mainly those languages. So if you Elixir curious, hit me up. Here's things that I've heard developers say, and I've probably said these myself. I mean, usually I want to make a web app look pretty good without really going deeply into CSS magic, playing whack-a-mole. And I want to be able to, like, I guess one thing that we haven't been able to do is just like lift up bits of HTML and bits of CSS and put it into another app. That is something that I've always wanted to do, and Tailwind can sort of help us with that, and we'll see why. So I sort of thought with some of the context, it might be worth just looking at the history of styling on the web. I mean, it's only, how many years ago? It's only about 25, 30 years old, and it's been quite a journey. So let's have a look down memory lane. So this is kind of trivia, like count how many of these that you might have used in your time, and we'll do a count at the end. So these are the kinds of things that we used to use in HTML in the long distant past when the web was early. And we don't do that anymore. Does anyone remember frame set? That was a good one. Frame set for layout was something that I used. This is what our HTML looked like. We used this kind of font tag for doing all kinds of stuff. Who did 1x1 invisible GIFs for layout? That was a bit of a classic. This stuff used to be super hard and kind of ridiculous. And the old classic image maps for clicking giant images and having special shaped buttons and so forth. And even recently, like rounded corners before border radius came in, that was kind of nasty. This old classic blink. Inline JS. So yeah, 1 point for every time you've used one of those before. And that is your web developer age. So stick your score in the chat. So that's what it hasn't really taken off. But I haven't mentioned it in my slides, but it's a good point. There is ways to scope things, and sort of effectively they were just trying to hide away the CSS into a local scope, basically. Another approach is to take a sort of naming convention approach to the whole thing.
Stuff is working, eh?
Did someone ask you a question?
Sorry, I got on mute.
No worries. So another approach was using BEM and SMACs and a bunch of different naming conventions with lots of underscores and dashes to kind of scope your CSS so that it became not impossible to use on a large project. But it really didn't. I mean, it sort of addressed the global nature, but it didn't do it through anything but just plain old convention. So it needed vast amounts of discipline to make it work. It was super easy to break the conventions, and if you did, then things went horribly wrong. And it meant that you had to sort of commit to one approach, or it got pretty weird. And so mixing and matching is kind of tricky. Again, stopping us from like picking up HTML and CSS and dropping it places. Another approach was UI frameworks. So we've all sort of seen Bootstrap and Foundation and Semantic and Bulma, and there's tons of them. Look, they work pretty well. And, you know, I'm pretty sure everyone's had a go at using something like Bootstrap, but it works well until you need to customize it or extend it or make it look different to what you need it to do, or theme it properly. And if you sort of, they added behavior and different components that, you know, caused issues, basically, if you didn't want that. Or if you didn't want the way they built it, like Bootstrap was built in jQuery, I believe. So in JavaScript land, CSS and JS, so style components, you might have heard of all the different, there's probably a dozen different ones. The idea was to scope your styles and declare what they look like inside a component. And so we just looked at what components look like in Rails land. What's really nice about this is it removes the need for you to actually think about classes, naming them, and actually figuring out how to attach them to the DOM. What you do is you declaratively style your components inside your component, and then effectively the toolchain works out how to attach your styles in the most efficient way to the DOM, which is pretty awesome. This is a little awkward for server-side rendering. I don't think I've heard of anyone doing that. I'm sure you probably could, but I'm sure it's not that easy. You end up with really ugly class names, but super optimized code. So, you know, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. You've got the sort of JavaScript toolchain doing stuff for you there. So yeah, it's not going to work great in Rails. Weirdly, it doesn't end up as composable as you might think from this.
Are you talking about CSS modules here?
Yeah, so CSS modules was sort of the start of CSS and JS, but it's sort of an umbrella term for that all the way up to styled components. So some of them take different approaches, but they've largely sort of ended up on a pretty common approach. You're declaring what a component looks like next to the component, and the toolchain figures out how to attach the classes and the CSS to the DOM. So it basically changes how we do the separation of concerns. So on the left side is how we used to think about doing it, which was the globally scoped separation. So you've got JavaScript all in sort of one place, CSS all in one place, HTML. And then there's a component view on the right-hand side. So for each component, you've sort of got all the behavior and the styles and the markup all in one place, which I think we're sort of deciding that that's a better way to do it. So enter Tailwind. It's what's called a utility first approach. Effectively, it's just a really thin abstraction layer over CSS rules. And there's a pretty clear and simple mapping directly to CSS rules that you know to class names, effectively. I think probably the highlight of this is that it's the most composable approach that I've seen. So it's sort of, if you have Tailwind set up in another project, you can easily cut and paste like HTML and classes that are embedded inside of it and make it look right. Yes, you still could get conflicts potentially, but it works really quite well. And it's just plain old classes. So we're sort of going back to the simple world of HTML with some classes, and the classes that Tailwind provides effectively just map to simple rules. So it plays well with others. You can sort of mix and match. It's worth noting that it intentionally does not give you anything like behavior, and it doesn't give you any pre-canned components. The idea is you've got a toolkit to go and build your own. And you can do that pretty quickly. So I think the key thing, and sort of the reason for this talk, I guess, because I don't usually work in Rails, but what I do work in is Phoenix and Elixir. And it's effectively the same thing, which is, it's the Elixir version of Rails. It's server-side rendered. We're doing a lot of stuff with live view these days, which is definitely was a problem when I was used to using styled components, and I was pretty excited about it in React. But then when we went back to server-side render land, it was, okay, it's going to be difficult to use that styled component toolchain. And so I was looking for something simpler. And someone mentioned it at the Perth Rails camp. And I was like, yeah, sounds interesting. I'll check it out later. So I did check it out, and I quite like it. And I'm sort of actually preferring it over the styled components idea. So I think the key thing is when you don't have components built for you, there's nothing to undo later, because, I mean, it works great at the beginning, but it really doesn't work later in a project when you're just going, this isn't so great. You've got themability. You'll see in a minute, we start with a pretty well-defined blank slate. So you're just building stuff and you're not unpicking other people's things. yeah, no whack-a-mole. There's no sort of contract to maintain between your markup and your CSS. And I think that was one of the other pains that I've seen building web apps over the years, is you've got the CSS requiring a particularly specific structure, of markup, depending on how you do it, and that's tricky. So this is what we looked like before Tailwind. We've got lots of class names that we have to think about and manage. A pretty simple little notification component. And we've got a whole bunch of styles to go along with that. And this is what it looks like in Tailwind. So you might be thinking, okay, this is a little bit funky. What are all these obscure class names? I think that's generally the first reaction most people have. I certainly thought, oh, that's pretty ugly. I don't like that approach. But what's nice about it is it's super composable, and you're calling out to globally defined class names that can't really conflict with anything else, and they stay pretty static. So I'll go through an example in a bit, but largely, you can look at, we've got flexbox happening, we've got heights and widths, we've got margins and paddings and text sizes. And so basically it's a bit more compact. This is the cheat sheet that I'll show you in a bit, but basically it's worth having a look at this. I've got a link at the end. It's pretty much everything in a couple of pages of stuff. And you click these and there's a few more bits inside. So it's relatively simple and pretty well scoped, and it doesn't map to every single CSS rule that you could possibly have. If you don't have something that Tailwind covers, you can always write your own CSS and add to it. But I found it pretty good. What else has it got out of the box? Responsive design. We've got ways of, if you look at down the bottom, we've got ways of basically affecting using the MD colon is medium size, LG colon is large size. So when you hit that media query, you can turn on the following class name or the rule. So responsive is in there by default, and it's pretty nice to do. We've also got pseudo class variants. So if you want to do hover, focus, and active states and that kind of stuff, we can do that as well. We'll look at an example in a sec, so don't worry if you can't read it all. Theming's pretty straightforward. So if you want to customize how Tailwind works, it's got a pretty good default set of things that look pretty great. But if you want to change any of the breakpoints or fonts or any of the settings of padding, colors, spacings, all that kind of stuff is totally up for themability. A couple of other things that are worth noting. Tailwind 1.2 just introduced animation support, which is really quite nice. I mean, animation I don't use enough in CSS to remember how to do it. I found it kind of awkward. But I was able to really just build nice animations pretty quickly with the Tailwind classes. It uses post CSS, which is not as weird as I thought it might be, because I was like, oh, we're moving away from Sass here, which I've used for a long time. But I think post CSS works pretty well. The other thing that's worth noting is that it does by default produce all of the classes. And so if you're after an optimized CSS bundle size, you can basically remove all the dead code with purge CSS. So I think, yeah, I was skeptical about the style at the beginning. And once I tried it, I got into it pretty quickly. And I think it is something that does look pretty ugly when you first start or you first glance at it. You need to give it a go. A couple of other things, adding base styles to Preflight. Preflight is basically what Tailwind calls all of their styles that they leave you with to begin. So it starts with a reset called normalized CSS, which is pretty standard. It goes and adds a couple of extra opinions on top, largely about removing margins and removing any stuff that's going to potentially conflict with you just doing what you want. The net effect of all of that is that it largely does what you would expect, which is pretty great in my opinion. If you do need to do some cross-cutting styles or create your own styles, what you can do, and this is the sort of Tailwind main CSS file. It's sort of including the various Tailwind bits. You can add Tailwind sort of utility classes to particular elements or classes or what have you. So you can use the add apply command to sort of do whatever you want and extract whatever CSS you want. That isn't actually the style that I would recommend though. This is what it looks like when you want to extract, particular button classes because you're duplicating stuff. And it was nice that Julian went first because the way that I would definitely recommend is doing it via components. So basically, instead of deduplicating your common strings of CSS classes, what you can do is effectively just put them into components, and it keeps everything sort of tidy, and it ends up meaning that you don't actually write any CSS at all that's custom, which keeps everything together, keeps it easy to understand and easy to change. And it seems weird at first, but it works pretty well. So any questions on that stuff before I head into a demo? All right, let's see what this looks like in practice. So what I've got here is, it's not actually a Rails app, it's an Elixir Phoenix app, but it doesn't matter for the purpose of this. It's just a HTML view. It's pretty much the same as Rails, and there's nothing fancy going on. So this is what it looks like. I've got some HTML on the left. It's spitting out on the right. And what I'm going to do is style it up to look nice. So you'll notice that it looks pretty plain. There's nothing special going on. There's not even any default styling for headings or anything like that. There's no margin, none of that kind of stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of add some padding to the whole thing so it sort of sits out from the edges a bit. Basically, this is P is for padding, 8 is for the 8th slot. I'm just sort of eyeballing it, but there's a nice sort of rhythm to it. I think it's sort of Fibonacci or something. But anyway, you can change that kind of structure if you want. We could do things like padding X, P, X8, P, Y8 to get X dimension or Y dimension. You can go left, right, top, bottom with just PL. For example, PT is P top, P bottom. A little bit weird to start with, but once you get the hang of it, it's pretty consistent and works pretty well. So what we're going to do is make this text bigger and make it bolder because it's not bold enough. And then I'm going to just space out these little sections a bit. And I'm going to make this guy a little bit bolder. Hopefully this is all pretty explanatory. MB is like margin bottom. So I'm just going to space that out. Now, obviously, this is for a demo. One thing to keep in mind is when you're doing spacings and sort of laying out components, that should be in a different component to the thing that you have. So what I'm going to do is make a button. So what I'm going to do is give it a background of blue. And one thing that's quite nice about Tailwind is the colors are pretty well laid out. So it's got a reasonably nice, easy to work with color scheme out of the box. So what I'm going to do is make that a blue 600, which is a slightly, is it darker or, yeah, slightly darker blue when we hover over it. Still looks pretty ugly, so let's give it some padding.
What does the number mean?
It's basically like the lightest to the darkest. So 100 will be the lightest blue, 900 would be the darkest blue. So I'm going to give it a padding X of 4. And remember the number on the end of this is just going to the slot that you've defined. So it's similar to the theme UI and a bunch of other ways of doing this. So we've got ourselves a button. It's got a little hover style. If anyone remembers how hard it was to do rounded corners before CSS or had that border radius, this is pretty nice. What else do we need? Maybe a font bold. And there we go. There's our button. And let's make the text white. So pretty simple to start stuff. What I'm going to do is just apply this to the next thing. Any questions on that so far?
How would you increase the rounding?
You can go rounded full if you like, if you want a sort of full pill shape. You can do MD, which is sort of short for medium. I think you could do large. I'm going off memory, but that does work. So you can do rounded small or just rounded as a reasonable default. Rounded large.
Cool.
So it really lets you, notice I'm not flicking between files, and that's sort of the other awkward thing. I'm not having to think of class names. Yes, I'm going to be duplicating some of these strings, but Julian already showed you the way to fix that is by making components, or you could have partials or what have you. Oops. All right, so this is just an alert, which is a slightly more fancy thing, and you'll notice that we've got an SVG there. So what I'm going to do is something similar, just background teal. You'll notice that sometimes I install an IntelliSense thing that's quite new. I don't think it's fully working yet, probably because I didn't create the file that it said I had to create. But apparently tooling is getting better very rapidly. So what I'm going to do is just sort of add some border around this. So these are all the colors. So you'll notice some patterns to how they do colors. It's all pretty consistent. So once you've sort of done it for half an hour, you'll sort of largely get the hang of it. So rounded B is a rounded bottom. Add some padding to this, add some vertical padding. And then let's get some shadow. Did I spell it right? No, shadow. And this is shadow medium. All right, so we've got a nice little alert box there.
With all the variants of each style, are you ending up including a mountain of CSS, or does it have some sort of compilation that just strips it down to what you're actually using?
Yeah, so that's the purge CSS. Like it will, by default, give you a giant bundle of everything. And so you definitely, if you want something that's pretty fast. Although, to be fair, it's probably smaller than most large projects end up with anyway. But yeah, you do get the kitchen sink, and it is worth using purge CSS to go and just remove the bits you're not using. So it'll go and examine like the classes to see what you've actually used. So that's kind of nice. There's a little SVG here that represents an icon. Now, the thing I wanted to talk about in the SVG world is inline SVG is totally a thing that you can do, and it's pretty awesome. I remember the days of just fiddling with other people's icon libraries and that kind of stuff. So really the benefit here is you can just go off to there's a bunch of these kind of things, but one of the ones that the Tailwind people recommend is feather icons. And what you can do is sort of adjust the size over here, adjust the stroke width, get what kind of style that you want, and literally just download it. So you can either just do an inspect. Did that work? Why did that not work? And get it, like literally copy the SVG out of here, copy out our HTML, and then paste it in. So assume that I just did that. Just a pro tip, you can get rid of the XML namespacing, you can get rid of the width and height, and some of the stroke equals. And what we end up doing is just adding width and height to this thing here. So width 6, height 4, I think we'll go for. Let's just go back to here. So we've just added an icon in, and it's completely self-contained, which is really nice because, I mean, icons don't always deserve their own component. So it's nice to just be able to drop them in inline. They work pretty well.
Is that fully cross-browser supported? I recall some weird thing where you had to have like the size on the SVG container and also on the thing inside it.
It's a good question, and I don't know. But
Okay.
I would suggest that most modern browsers would support it. But yeah, look, I think in all the browsers I've tried, this works, and there is a size on the class. You know, it really just makes it look nicer. So if you want to keep the width and height there because you have to support older browsers, go for it. It doesn't make any difference, really. It just makes it tidier for inlining SVGs, basically. So you do need to have the view box there because that describes, you know, the sort of the dimensions. One thing, if you're not used to SVGs, that confused me one time was it's actually not a XY coordinate for both. It's actually an XY coordinate, which is the starting sort of origin, and then it's the width and the height. So don't let that catch you out, because it certainly has caught me out. And this is the bit you probably want to get from another tool, but you can do your own kind of drawing primitives in there if you want to draw circles or squares or what have you. It's super nice for doing, you know, developer-based drawing for those of you who, and you know, if you want to do it in a tool, you're going to have to clean up these paths as well. So that's pretty much the SVG tip that I really like. When you're doing it with Tailwind, what you want to do is do something called fill current. And what that does is just make that the current color. So we could go, it takes the current color that you've defined on the element or a parent element. So we're going to go text teal 900, let's say. I don't know if you can see that changing. Did it change? Let's make a margin. Probably make that a little bit bigger. Does this color change? Yeah. So that's the kind of the neat little trick with, you've got to define a width and height here in the modern browsers. In order to take the color that you've defined on this element or a parent element, you've got to use fill current, or if it's got a stroke on it, a stroke current. Make sure your view box is there, and then largely that's pretty much how you do inline SVGs. That's pretty nice. How are we doing for time? Got time for one more slightly fancier example?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So let's make this look better. Any questions on that stuff so far? Is it relatively self-explanatory? One thing I will say is that I did get over the fear of duplication on some of this stuff for prototyping purposes, because it's way easier to just copy paste stuff in line. Do it. All right, so what I'm going to do is make a card component. How are we going to do this? So what I'm going to do is set the max width on it. And this is going to be a small max width. So we've limited how wide that's going to be. Going to make it rounded. I'm also going to make sure that the image inside of it doesn't disappear out the end of it. And I'm going to stick a border shadow on it so you can see it properly. So we've got a shadow. I'm going to uncomment this image. And we've got the start of a card component. All right, what else do we need to do? So we probably need to give that some padding. So I'm going to give it X padding of 6 and a Y padding of 4. That looks pretty decent. We've got that. That looks all right. The text looks okay. And then what I'm going to do is make some little pills down the bottom. Let's get some padding on this to match up to the top one. All right. So what I want to do is make that a little pill shape. Now, because this is a span, I'm going to make it a block element. Or an inline block even. Give it a gray background. And pills usually have that full rounded, so we'll go rounded, full. And we need padding. So X3, usually you need more padding on the X than the Y. And there we go. Maybe let's make that text smaller. Make the font semi-bold. And just fade it out a little bit. How does that look? Not too bad. All right. So yeah, that's pulling stuff in Tailwind. Obviously, there's a lot more to it. I've only touched on just some of the stuff that's going on there. The cheat sheet is pretty comprehensive. I haven't found anything it doesn't have that I needed, but you know, if you're doing fancy stuff, you probably will. Certainly, I really enjoyed the stuff that they added in 1.2, particularly things like stroke width. If you're doing SVGs, you can set the stroke that way. You can do all kinds of transforms, scaling and rotating. That's pretty interesting. And transitions help you do really easy animations. Out of the scope of this talk, but it certainly made that much, much easier. And it's super cool. So I think generally, when I got into this, I found it's super easy to just make CSS do what I wanted it to do. And I think there's nothing really magic going on. You can easily see all of these utility classes are pretty simple, and they usually only have like 1 or 2 rules in there. You can actually see in the cheat sheet that you can see exactly what it's doing. So there's no magic. I think that's the key thing. Make it look good without any magic and no whack-a-mole. What else do I want to cover? Oh, right. So I think the other thing is, because you don't get a set of components out of the box, what they did do, and this is a paid for thing, which I have gone and paid for because I found it immensely useful, is they've got, sort of marketing and application things, components already pre-canned. So what you can do is sort of go to their site, look at the menu of components that you want and go, yeah, I want something like that. They're all nice and responsive, and they've spent a lot of time designing them and making them work responsively. And basically what you can do is just hit the code button. And I think that just puts it in the copy buffer. And we can just paste it. Why don't we just paste it over here? I didn't try this beforehand, but that's what I've always wanted. I want copy and paste CSS, no funny business. So it's all self-contained, just because we've installed Tailwind, we get that. So that's pretty cool. So that is super nice, and it's got marketing stuff. They're still building it out, so some of the things aren't there, but it's only been out for like maybe a couple of months, 2 or 3 months maybe.
How much is it?
It's a good question. There's probably a pricing page. Pricing.
Using that component.
Yeah, probably. I'm logged in, but just go to tailwindui.com. Someone can paste the link, perhaps. It's pretty reasonable. to be honest. I paid for a team license for everyone. We can use it on client projects, and it represents quite a lot of useful stuff. So I bought it without hesitation. So, you've got sort of inspiration for components that you can use in all your applications. Tables, they're kind of nice. They're kind of fancy. Forms.
Okay, the whole lot to get all the components is $249 US.
Yeah, which I think is pretty reasonable, given how much time would it actually take you to.
Yeah, that's not many developer hours.
Go and re-implement it. It's sort of a no-brainer. I mean, it's at least a couple of hours of your time to do anything like this. And they spend a lot of time designing it. Like, even just the form stuff's really nice. So I guess the key thing is that, you're not unpicking someone else's interpretation of what they think you want with all the behavior. The key thing with these things, though, is that it doesn't, I believe it comes with, is it? It's a good question. I believe it comes with Alpine, which I was quite intrigued by. Is it Alpine? Could be wrong. So they do have requires JS here, and I think there is. I'm not sure where it is. But yeah, basically what they use is Alpine JS, which is like a really simple view-like thing. And it's not terrible. So when we're doing stuff in live view, which is all server-side rendered, server-side managed state, which is pretty exciting. What we want to do is manage all of our application logic server-side, but any kind of JavaScript sprinkles that you don't really care about keeping the state on the server, you can actually do with Alpine, which is quite nice. So I haven't really checked it out, but I've done a little bit with it, and it was like, seems unintrusive. So yeah, for the components where they don't give you any components, this can kind of help you figure that stuff out, and stop you having to do all the styling to make it look good. So even if you just use this as a starting point, it's pretty handy. So drop downs, all the kinds of things you'd expect. Yeah, I think that's mostly all I wanted to show you. Yeah, any questions?
Are there any open source initiatives similar to this Tailwind UI?
It's a good question. I believe there are, but they're nowhere near as good as this. So for $250, if you're doing paid for projects, I think it's worth it. Or you could just look at their component and do it yourself pretty easily. I think there are things like Tailwind Toolbox, but no, I haven't. I mean, there are stuff, but I haven't found anything that's really good. So yeah, there's a couple of things. You could probably Google for them.
So if you wanted to customize like the base styles that Tailwind ships in, is that the config JavaScript file you mentioned during the talk?
Yeah, correct. Or what you do is you go here and you do what I did mention, which was this stuff here. So if we wanted to, change, like add our own element styles, we could do the add apply, or you could do the theming, which was, where is it? This stuff here. So it's the Tailwind config if you wanted to change what Tailwind ships with, colors, fonts, spacing, dimensions, whatever. Any of the defaults are modifiable. Is that what you meant, this theming?
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant.
Cool. I will show you one thing on the SVG front, because I didn't really talk about SVG too much. I built this thing using SVG and Live View, which is a flight simulator. And all of the top two components are all done just with hand-drawn SVG and translation and rotation directives. So if you want to check that out, it's over there. But all of the state for this is managed on the server side in the States, weirdly. I still don't understand why it's so fast. So yeah, things you can do with SVG. This is all, let's have a look at it. So all it's doing as I move stuff is just rotating around. So you can see down here, all I'm doing is just rotating the group of stuff that represents those lines and numbers.
And that's you fiddling with the keyboard, right?
Yeah, that's me just using the arrow keys to fly left and right.
That's absolutely amazing.
So there you go, fun things you can do with SVG rather than just icons. You can do all kinds of stuff. So yeah, once I drew this, all the heavy lifting was done with just that little rotation directive here.
What did you use to draw those SVGs?
My eyes and my fingers.
But like, did you use Illustrator or did you use?
No, I literally typed it in.
Oh, all right.
That took me a few hours, I can tell you. But I find that easier than using Illustrator, weirdly, because I'm a developer. Cool. Any other questions?
Yes,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
What is the .links extension on the page?
So that is basically ERB for live view. This is a Phoenix app, remember?
Uh-huh.
Not a Rails app. But it's basically the same thing as an ERB template. So yeah, live view allows you to effectively open a WebSocket and send all of your server-side rendered stuff and send it to the client automatically without writing any JavaScript, which is super nice. Alrighty.
Were you saying before? Oh, yeah, there you go.
Oh, thank you. I do have a question. Like, I found that this view component Tailwind match is pretty interesting.
Yep.
However, I found it a little bit unintuitive to build things like form elements or links in Tailwind and view component because you would kind of lose the Rails helpers, right? Have you had like a similar experience with something in Phoenix? I don't know if Phoenix has the same concept of those helpers and components or something like that.
That's a good question.
Can't you supply to the Rails helper like classes that it should also add to the thing?
Yeah, you can pass classes to the helper. You could also, as we saw in the presentation, you could abstract those classes into like a super class, like a bottom class. But I'm thinking if there is a way to abstract those into a component that still uses or that doesn't lose the nice developer experience that Link2 has or that a form element has.
Yeah. I mean, aren't you just passing classes like normal? I'm not sure I understand what you lose there.
Like whenever you build a Rails form, you have a form for and you have, or a form with in nowadays, and you have f dot text area or text input.
Yeah. You can always customize those with your own classes.
Yes, and that's, yeah. But what I found a little bit weird is that to have a consistent input field everywhere, I either have to create a separate class with Tailwind that is, I don't know, form input class that applies all of the Tailwind styles, or I would have to extract that into a component. So you suggested that it's better to always use the Tailwind classes. However, you would need to start copy and pasting a lot of Tailwind classes into each input field of your app to make it consistent.
Right, I see what you mean. I think the right answer is really when you're seeing duplication, you've probably got a component of some kind.
Yeah.
And where you don't have a component, just let the duplication fly, because you probably want to change one thing without changing the other thing. So, I think it's generally better, and I've flip-flopped on this, to have your markup and your styles together in some fashion, whether that's using the style component way or the CSS and JS way, or whether it's putting your utility classes next to your HTML or in it.
Thanks, Josh.
But yeah, I think generally the answer is components are pretty good. And certainly going from React land back to server-side rendered Rails or Phoenix, you miss the components, to be honest.
Yeah, I'll definitely try to explore a way to use view components with those things that Rails already provides, like links and form elements.
I think if you don't want to do a component, you can always extract a bunch of repetitive class utility classes into your own named class.
Yeah, that's what we've been doing, and it works pretty well.
Yep.
But you return a little bit into what do I name this thing land.
Yeah, but it's not as much, right?
Yeah, definitely, it's not as much.
And I think I would definitely prefer to go down the build a component and do all of your abstraction there, rather than writing CSS. And if you do that, you literally don't write any CSS unless you're doing something funky that Tailwind doesn't support, which is honestly amazing. It's a world I want to live in. You're writing CSS without writing it. It's pretty great.
Does Tailwind add to load times to your web page?
Add what, sorry?
Load times.
To your application?
Yeah.
I mean, no differently to having CSS. I mean, what it produces is just plain old CSS.
Okay.
So, like I said, if you are not using all of Tailwind, and you're probably not, and you want an optimized bundle, you're going to need to follow the instructions to use purge CSS to get rid of the stuff you're not using. You definitely want to do that. Otherwise, it will add significant delay. Cool. All right, I'll keep tracking. If you're interested in the live view stuff or Elixir, we're doing a workshop at Lambda Jam, which is back. Yay. And for the Elixir curious, there is a Elixir talk track, which is pretty awesome. I think there's like 4 or 5 Elixir or Erlang talks. So if you're curious, check it out. The link is there. And I think that the prices are pretty cheap because it really isn't costing them much to put it on. So here are some resources: Tailwind UI, the cheat sheet, feather icons, and the flight sim. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Josh.
Bye.